Today at the National Press Club, the outgoing president of the National Farmers Federation, Fiona Simson. In her 7 years as president, she's been at the forefront of national policy debates and seen the farm lobby through unprecedented trade bans, biosecurity threats and a pandemic. Fiona Simson with today's Press Club address.
My name's Kath Sullivan. I am the National Rural Reporter with the ABC and also President of the National Rural Press Club. Our guest today is Fiona Simson, President of the National Farmers Federation, with her address to both the rural and national press clubs of Australia. And quite proudly, she is also patron of the National Rural Press Club. Fiona is a key figure in Australian agriculture and has been so since 2008, becoming the first female president of the national lobby, the NFF, in 2016. During her leadership, she's steered the farming community through not record droughts, and I was going to say 2 exceptional seasons, but not sure how you feel about that today, Fiona. As a farmer herself, she's worked to open doors for women and young people in the sector, including launching the NFF's Diversity in Ag Leadership Program, and of course she has spearheaded the NFF's 2030 $100 billion vision. You can follow the conversation today on Twitter or X at Press Club Australia or by using the hashtag NPC. Please join me in welcoming Fiona Simson.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional people of the land on which we farm at home, the Gomeroi people, and thank them for the partnership, support and guidance that they've gifted my family over a number of generations and have certainly supported me through my leadership journey. At the risk of singling out a room full of people who have all played, I think, a significant role in my journey, I'd really like to acknowledge and pay special thanks to Tony Ma, the CEO of the NFF. Tony has been my right-hand man and sounding board for the nearly 7 years that I've held this role. His level head and his passion for what he does has made whatever success that we've had in that time possible. Thank you, Tony, for weathering what must have been a constant barrage of thought bubbles and executing so many of them so beautifully and ignoring so beautifully those that didn't make any sense at all. I also want to acknowledge and thank our members, many of whom I can see represented in the room here today. It's the members who granted me this incredible opportunity to lead the NFF, and it's their wisdom, collective wisdom and expertise that has determined every position that we've taken during my time at the NFF. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I'm a little overwhelmed, to be honest, to see so many faces and people who have played such a part in my journey. So thank you all very much. I'm feeling very honoured and humbled, and if I can get through this week without bursting into tears at some point, that will be a good thing. Lastly, most importantly, I want to thank my family. Ed, who I'm really excited is with me here in the room today, and my children Tom and Jemima. This job certainly takes its pound of flesh, and there's no way that I could have done the endless travel, the phone calls, the media interviews, the Zoom meetings, weathered the frank feedback sometimes and hard conversations that are part of this role, or simply had the ability to step away from the farm and the home so often without your support. I'm really looking forward to spending more time with you on home turf with grandchildren as well, and you'll soon be sick of me. I should also perhaps in a roundabout sort of way thank BHP. I don't suppose there's anybody from BHP in the room here today? No. After all, I'd never gone looking for a career in advocacy. As many of you will know, it wasn't until BHP came knocking and they wanted to dig up the Liverpool Plains that I realised the need to speak up on behalf of food and fibre production and the people who care so deeply for their land. I suppose that like many people going about their lives, running their businesses, caring for their families, you don't think that something as essential as feeding and clothing ourselves would require much advocacy. Who could disagree or want to limit something that satisfies the most basic of human needs? Surely keeping the voters fed and clothed would be an obvious priority for any government. But in the 17 years that have passed since that time, I've learnt that that isn't always the case. Usually through sheer ignorance, ideas that are bad in food and fibre production can absolutely gain traction. The dumb luck of these bad ideas is made all the more easy in an environment where the average voter knows increasingly less about us as farmers and the work that we do. Connecting city and country is one of the things that I've dedicated much of my time to over my advocacy career. Trying to bridge that gap between farmers and consumers, to improve the shared understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that we both face, and to foster a more collaborative and proactive approach to policy making. It's so easy to curry favour in some parts of the bush by further wedging the city-country divide, by talking about us and them, talking about the latte sippers and how they don't care or they don't understand. That sort of talk, though, in my view, is not leadership. And it also ignores the fact that you can get a bloody good latte in Werris Creek or Gunnedah these days. Even on my farm. The us and the them rhetoric pushes us farmers further from the people that we ultimately serve, the people who eat our food and use our fibre. It plays on and builds on the damaging misconception some farmers hold that what they do isn't valued by the broader community, and we know that has real repercussions. So I hope that I have been one of a growing number of rural leaders who have relegated that sort of talk to the past. But there's no shying away from the fact that we do face a growing disconnect in the community's understanding of agriculture. That's an enormous problem because we need them with us. The big conversations about the future of farming impact them too, and they deserve to have an informed view on what lies ahead. I'm incredibly proud of the work that NFF has done during my time to bridge this gap. We've invested really for the first time in awareness and communications campaigns that bring the story of farming to an urban audience. That work through our Telling Our Story Fund now reaches millions of Australians every year with an honest and authentic message about who we are and what we do. We've also sought to empower others in industry to do the same. Platforms like National Ag Day, coming up very soon on the 17th of November, provide an opportunity for the people in our industry to share their stories directly, again reaching millions and millions of people in the media through in-person events and online. We are getting increasingly savvy in facing up to the disconnect and filling the gaps in community understanding with factual information, and in helping them feel more connected to farming families, despite the immense distances that sometimes separate them. I see this as an ongoing challenge, and one where I hope we're only seeing the start of what industry can achieve through greater transparency and storytelling with the Australian public. The face of farming is certainly changing, and I'm incredibly proud of how far the farm sector has come over recent years. What I've observed is an industry that is more ready to face up to the big challenges and opportunities, to read and acknowledge the prevailing winds and set your sails accordingly. From an NFF perspective, our vehicle for doing this has been the 2030 Roadmap, an ambitious plan to grow the farm sector to $100 billion in farm output by 2030. I'm immensely proud of the work that we did to engage industry broadly in the development of that plan, and how we were able to bring people along in setting bold targets on challenging issues that we're well on the way to meeting today. The success of the roadmap has been in setting a simple goal that anyone can buy into. It's garnered support across party lines too, with the support of 3 Prime Ministers and 4 Agriculture Ministers. The widespread support for that $100 billion vision has allowed a more positive, future-focused discussion about the future success of our industry. It's played a small part in repositioning agriculture in the minds of many from a legacy industry, viewed with nostalgia, to a sector offering an excitable and sustainable source of growth, one that thrives on innovation and new ways of working. But it's what's underneath the headline growth figures that gets me really excited. It's the detailed targets and ambitions where we're starting to really move the dial towards better outcomes. Take our sustainability agenda as an example. Climate change has long been a vexed and divisive political issue in our sector, with farmers in various camps frustrated that their deeply held views didn't represent a consensus amongst the farming population. What we've seen in recent years is a series of acknowledgements. Firstly, a widespread acknowledgement that the climate is changing, with many farmers believing that they're witnessing these effects firsthand. Second, an acceptance that the world is changing, and that regardless of what we might think or what we might want, our governments, customers and financial institutions globally are moving towards climate action with real consequences for our sector. And lastly, a recognition that we need to keep ahead of this change. I'm proud to say that we're doing that, having set ambitious sectoral targets for our own emissions reduction, backed economy-wide action, and backed that in a practical sense by providing the lion's share of offsets and abatement under federal government programs to date. Now, that doesn't mean that we've simply decided to stop swimming and let the current take us. We're entering the climate transition with our eyes wide open. We're alive to the threats, such as the impact of a changing climate, or poor planning of renewables, transmission infrastructure and carbon offsets on agricultural land. But we're also alive to the opportunities, like positioning Australia as a global leader in low emissions farming, and enabling farmers to make informed decisions about monetising their carbon assets. I'm also excited about the progress we've made in moving beyond simply talking about carbon to kick-starting a more holistic discussion about the sustainability and natural capital attributes of our farms. Informed by some incredibly clever thinkers, of course within our membership, but also including partnerships and collaboration with the Australian Government, ANU, KPMG, CSIRO and Farming for the Future, we've sought to better understand how we measure, manage, monetise and communicate our sustainability. At a grassroots level, that's involved working with Farming for the Future to measure and baseline the natural capital assets of 1,000 farms. That's going beyond carbon to understand the health of our ecosystems, from biodiversity to soil health to the health of our waterways. This helps us not only get better at quantifying the natural capital, but also to start understanding the link between natural capital and farm productivity. At an industry level, we're working with government and all industry subsectors to develop the very first Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework, one of our very important roadmap goals. Now, in its final stages of development, this framework provides a translation layer between the targets and the metrics used by our diverse industries around the country, all the way up to global frameworks like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and is a global first. This ensures that when we tell our sustainability story on the world stage, we're speaking the same language as our customers, our investors, foreign governments, and stands up to the rigour of any international standard. This is truly exciting. We also remain committed to finding a pathway to reward farmers financially for their stewardship of the environment. As farmers, we manage well over half of the Australian continent. We invest significant sums of our own money to care for the country, managing introduced pests and weeds, restoring waterways and protecting habitat for native plants and animals. There is so much more farmers could do if given the resources. That's why we've supported the idea of a nature repair market across 2 governments now. And while we still hope that we can lead the world in that proactive partnership approach to environmental sustainability. Everything I've just described was in that roadmap plan that we developed and released in 2018. Fast forward 5 years and we're seeing all of these initiatives flourish, some led by NFF, but many led by third parties, working separately but in alignment with industry's goals. Our approach to sustainability is just one area where I believe we've seen a step change as we pursue our roadmap agenda. And I could talk all day about other areas like digital literacy and connectivity, risk management or innovation, but instead I want to talk briefly about one other topic, and that's our evolving approach to our people. That starts with our understanding of who our people actually are. For far too long, we saw only the faces and heard only the voices of white, male, middle-aged farmers. If you asked any urban Australian to describe a farmer to a sketch artist, that's invariably the image that you would get. And that's not to diminish the value and importance of those men, who do, of course, make up the lion's share of our sector. And there might be a few here in the room today, too, I think. But anyone who has sat around the kitchen table with a farming family will know that women have always been an equal driving force within our farm businesses. They were visible in the day-to-day operations on the farm, but they weren't visible in the boardrooms and leadership structures of our industry. At the time I took on this role, a lot was made of the fact that I was the first female to hold the position. And while I might have grimaced to see my gender leading the headlines rather than my agenda, I also understood the significance of the opportunity that I had as a female leader. That's why, through the roadmap, we set ourselves the target of levelling up representation in industry leadership. I'm immensely proud of the work that we've done through the NFF's Diversity in Agricultural Leadership program to mentor and elevate female leaders. That program, now in its 6th year, has supported more than 60 female leaders, many of whom have gone on to sit on boards, take on executive positions and become incredible leaders in their own communities. That program is just the NFF's small contribution to a growing number of initiatives, networks and organisations that are out there elevating the voices of rural women. And while we still have some way to go before we see equality in representation, it makes me incredibly happy as I finish my time at NFF to see those networks flourishing, to see a new generation of female advocates entering the limelight, and to know with confidence that as I step back, there is a whole pipeline of capable women ready to take my place and the others that are available within industry. We've also worked hard to give young farmers and aspiring farmers a greater voice and to attract a new generation of Australians to consider a career in ag, regardless of their background or where they grew up. Initiatives like our Emerging Leaders program and Young Farmers Council have helped give that new generation a greater voice around our table. And of course, a program that I am incredibly passionate about, Ag Career Start, is giving hundreds of young Australians the chance to try agriculture for the very first time. That program, which we run in partnership with the Commonwealth Government, is now selecting its 3rd cohort of 100 students, 100 young Australians, to take part in a structured gap year program on farms in every state and territory and across every commodity group. Those of us in the industry know just how rewarding a career in agriculture can be. Through Ag Career Start, we're able to share those rewards with a broader cross-section of school leavers who might not have that existing connection to farmers or the bush. Once again, this idea for an Ag Gap Year came from our 2030 roadmap and is just one more great example of how things that were just thought bubbles 5 years ago have now become successful initiatives that are significantly changing the face of our industry. The latest ABS census data shows a 30% increase in people aged 25 to 29 in the industry since 2006, with a 42% increase in young females in the 25 to 34 year age bracket. Half of our workers, aged 25 to 39, have one or more parents born overseas, compared to only 20% for 60 to 69-year-old workers. We have a great story to tell. But I can't talk about our people without also reflecting on the challenges and tough conversations that we've had in recent years. We continue to struggle to attract workers in sufficient numbers to keep pace with our growth. We've faced the frustration of watching a dedicated ag visa, something that we initially designed and fought long and hard for, to be taken away before it could deliver even a single worker, followed by a slashing of visa programs with nothing to take their place. We've also unfortunately seen continued reports of farmers failing to uphold workplace standards. I've been categoric in calling out where farmers have engaged in exploitative practices which have no place in our sector. We've led the call for tougher penalties for deliberate wage theft and supported the establishment of visa pathways with worker protections baked in. I'm incredibly proud to have led an industry that has faced up to these challenges with such courage and such conviction. You don't hear industry leaders defending our worst players, you hear us talking about solutions. And we've engaged on these issues directly and constructively with the unions through the tripartite process convened by Minister Watt. Our approach to these issues is very much reflective of our industry today, one which confronts its challenges, brings forward solutions, and is prepared to engage with whoever that can help us get where we need to go. unencumbered by historical assumptions about who we can and should collaborate with to get the job done for farmers. But while, as I've outlined, we've come an incredible distance as an industry on so many fronts, some things never change, nor would we want them to. One of those things is the need for the farmer's voice, the farmer's perspective, to always be heard in the national dialogue. I've always been incredibly proud to represent the farmer's perspective. I've found that farmers bring an incredibly grounded view to every discussion, no matter the topic. Always incredibly thoughtful and grounded in a very deep practicality. I can't help but think that the farmer's perspective is somewhat informed by our daily connection to nature, to having our fortunes dictated by its forces, and the reality check that that very much brings. In a world where people are so insulated and disconnected from forces beyond their control, farmers are now able to keep things in perspective, to understand that most things are cyclical in the long run. It's that moderating voice in an increasingly polarised world that I think farmers bring to the political debate right here in Australia. While traditionally viewed as conservative, I've never thought that that label sat very well. Any successful farmer embraces change and embraces new ideas. We have to. But they don't suffer nonsense, and they're not easily swayed by ideas that might be fashionable but lack merit. That's why I hope that despite numbering fewer than we might have a generation ago, we will always hear the farmer's voice in our discourse here in Australia and of course globally as well. That's why I'm so passionate about the success of the NFF as a vehicle to make the voice heard on the national stage. I'm proud of what we've been able to achieve in my time to give the NFF the resources and sustainable footing it needs to do what is going to be demanded of it in the coming years, as we continue to ensure farmers are heard and understood in our ever-expanding capital cities. We know full well that the NFF and the organisations that make up our membership will need to continue to evolve. We have to remain relevant to a new generation of farmers, and we need to ensure that our structures remain the best way to bring people together and to meet our advocacy needs into the future. As I see it, there has never been a more important moment for strong and sustained advocacy on behalf of our sector. I don't want to dwell here too much on current policy pressures on the sector. I'll direct you to our recent media statements, and you'll hear plenty more from our new President on this in the coming days. But suffice to say that history will not judge this government kindly if it continues to prosecute an agenda focused more on satisfying factions than facts. Particularly on issues like live sheep exports, a disaster for animal welfare, our ties in the Middle East and farmers across Australia, or water buybacks, tearing up some of the critical socio-economic community protections in the Basin Plan that we agreed on so many years ago. No, as much as I might like to unburden myself on some more of these issues, that will soon be someone else's job. As for me, I'll be focusing more on the global picture, wearing my hat as a new board member on the World Farmers Organisation. And it's through that prism of the global perspective that I look at the areas where governments are failing farmers here at home. And I can't help but think that it's just a local outbreak of harmful agricultural policies that is part of a broader epidemic that is raging worldwide. Whether it's restrictions on fertiliser use in the Netherlands, Sweden or Canada, methane taxes in New Zealand, anti-science scare campaigns against modern farming practices, or the 32 countries which have exposed export restrictions on food products or inputs since the outbreak of the war in the Ukraine. The result of these policies is the same. They will all contribute to pushing food and fibre production lower and the cost for consumers higher, at a time when we've never needed to grow more. Globally, this year there are 345 million people facing acute levels of food insecurity. That number has more than doubled since 2020. As we look towards a future of climate change and an extra 2 billion mouths to feed, the need to feed and clothe that population should be on an equal footing with any other challenge we face. Unfortunately, all too often it's the poor cousin, an afterthought, which is frequently the collateral damage of the climate agenda, or the latest act of a scare campaign, or a knee-jerk reaction to local price spikes. That's not to say that the climate agenda isn't important, but simply to say that we have to be able to choose two things at once. Policies which lower farm output should never be taken lightly. We need to constantly look forward 20 to 30 years into the future and remember the challenge that we face to grow production. Policies which shave 1% here and 1% there from farm output are just widening a future food supply gap that we ought to be narrowing. So as I see it, that's my new job, inserting the farmer's perspective into the big global discussions that really impact our future here in Australia, reminding global decision makers that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, that growing food and fibre isn't a luxury, it's an absolute necessity. I've had the privilege of taking part in some of these forums during my time with the NFF, and I can tell you that it has been an eye-opening experience. If I think about my trip to Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27 last year, me and other members of the Australian delegation managed to have some really important discussions with the people influencing the agenda in that forum. But if I zoom out, even if I include every other farming and aligned group from around the world, we really were just barnacles clinging to the hull of the climate change supertanker. And if I think about all the other barnacles sharing that albeit very important hull, selling the next planet-saving technology or brandishing a copy of their latest sustainability report, agriculture, growing food and fibre, was a long way from the front of people's minds. NFF certainly is not going to fix that, and Fiona Simson can't either. But we can make a difference by working collectively with like-minded organisations around the world to elevate the agricultural agenda and ensure that other worthy issues and causes can complement rather than compete with the cause of food and fibre production. So that's one of the things that you'll now find me doing. I'm sorry to those who thought that this would be the last that you'd hear from me, but my term at the NFF may have expired, but my passion certainly has not. And along with my other roles, such as the chair of ACR, I really want to acknowledge my new CEO, Wendy Umberger, who's over there in the room, and my other board roles. I'll still be out and about chewing someone's ear about our fabulous sector and helping out where I can. Before I stop talking and take some questions, I just want to say thank you, Kath, and your committee at the National Rural Press Club, of which I'm a very proud patron, and of course the National Press Club, Morris, for giving me the chance to share some final thoughts here today. Lastly, I just want to sincerely thank our NFF member bodies and farmers right across Australia, many of whom have taken the time in the last couple of weeks to reach out and thank me personally, for trusting me to represent their interests for nearly 7 years. They have granted me what will surely be the defining privilege of my professional life. I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed every single minute, but certainly I have valued every minute. I've always tried to remember what an important privilege this role is. Australian agriculture is the best industry on the planet. Its people are the best people that you could ever hope to meet. And our farming communities are the best places that a person could wish to call their home. I am so very grateful to have had the chance to share their story and support their future. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona Simson. I wanted to start with this relationship that the agriculture industry has with its consumers, a gap that you've tried to bridge. This is quite a supportive room, I think, but there are some people who have called for the Australian government to ban live sheep exports, a policy it's committed to. There are some people in Australia who say more water needs to be left in the Murray-Darling Basin, less water used to grow food and fibre, something you suggested would have been a no-brainer in the past. Have you failed to sell the message of Australian agriculture?
No, I don't think we've failed, but in actual fact, I think there was a time there where industry really did take its foot off the pedal. Farmers have always been there. We've been a part of our nation's history. And sometimes when you're on your farm and you're doing your thing, as an industry bodies too, then you just get sort of a little bit captured in your own world and thinking about what you do, and you start taking things for granted. And I actually reckon when I came into the industry, 15 years ago now, I actually think that recognition was starting to dawn, that people realised that some of the green groups, the active green groups, were actually taking hold, and that nobody was thinking about farmers. And we saw this demographic change too, where you used to have aunties and uncles and cousins and things in the bush, people who lived in the city, and now now that's completely changed. We have really a huge amount of the urban population that don't know and understand farmers very well. So I think we've made an impact. The fact of the success of programs like Ag Career Start, for example, the statistics that I read out from the ABS showed that we are having some impact, but we've certainly got more work to do. And I think we can't take for granted the research that NFF has done alongside that Telling Our Story project has said that by and large people actually do appreciate farmers. We like farmers. They like what we do, but they don't know much about it anymore. And that's why we do encourage people through Ag Day, National Ag Day, through our Ag Career Start, all the different programs that we at NFF run. It's about telling our story. It is about making sure that we can reach out to consumers. At NFF now we're actually able to reach out to particular segments of consumers because of the research that we've done, to keep telling that story in a more effective way.
And we're talking there about domestic policies, but at the moment Australia appears to be on the cusp of a free trade agreement with Europe. And I know you travelled there with the Agriculture Minister, I think earlier this year, to Berlin to pump up the green credentials or sustainability credentials of Australian ag. Has the Australian government heard your concerns about the way that farming is produced versus the wants of the Europeans and what they expect our exporters to do to reach those markets?
Look, I think the Australian government are very big supporters of Australia's sustainability credential. They partner with us in the Agricultural Sustainability Framework, which is a global first, and that involves commitment and dollars. So, and certainly while I was travelling with Minister Watt, very much have we been promoting that agricultural sustainability framework overseas. The EU trade deal, though, is a complicated one because agriculture is not at the moment getting a good deal at all. In fact, there is no sector in agriculture that is really getting any sort of a good deal in terms of the EU trade deal. So the government's going to have to weigh up what that means for a trade deal overall in terms of if there are good outcomes for the rest of the economy as opposed to what it's doing to agriculture, which is taking some sectors backwards. It's something that certainly industry is very engaged in. We've been engaged in for the whole 5 years that the agreement has been negotiated. But it's disappointing that really the most difficult things for agriculture have only been on the table in the last few months. So our message to government is stay at it, keep talking. If when you go to Japan, Osaka next week and the offers are no better, then keep talking, stay at the table, make sure that we can get a better outcome for agriculture and a better outcome for both the EU customers and the Australian producers as well.
And when you say it's a dud deal, is that because of the environmental standards the Europeans want to impose, or tariffs or GIs?
It's the deal as a whole. So at the moment, there's things like geographical indicators, which are going to add millions and millions of dollars to the cost of doing business here in Australia for dairy farmers. It's the fact that we are being treated worse off under the deal than some of our peers in New Zealand and in Canada and other countries as well. We have to have a deal that is going to make everybody better off. At the moment, it just looks like the EU is getting more of what they wanted and we're getting less. So we're very strong about this. I actually was just talking to Minister Farrell this morning about it, and we will continue to pursue a good deal for agriculture.
What did he say?
He thanked me for the kind words that I'd said about him in the China wine deal.
Very good. Jamison Murphy from The Land.
G'day, Fee. Thanks for your speech and your long career as an advocate for regional Australia. You mentioned several of the challenges that agriculture is facing in the short term. Many of them are government policies, and without getting you to weigh in specifically on any one policy, your thoughts are quite clear on that recently, and just taking a step back. Are you concerned about the legacy that this government will leave agriculture if a lot of these policies come to fruition in their current form?
Yes, and we've certainly been very open and transparent with the ministers in the government and the Prime Minister about the fact that right now, across various portfolios, there are decisions being made on issues and on policies that could change the face of farming as we know it. And when you look at some of the issues around the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, when you look at the live sheep export issue, when you look at the EPBC Act, when you look at the Nature Repair Bill, there's lots and lots of things that really provide some opportunities for agriculture, but could go the other way as well. And so it's really critically important, and NFF has focused long and hard on this, at trying to be in those discussions from the very beginning. We can't come into an environment where decisions have already been made and governments have made up their mind. We need to make sure that they are open to hearing from us, from hearing from our sector, from hearing from our members, from hearing from farmers themselves, and taking on board the facts and the data that we can give them. Because we're in a market-based economy here in Australia. We absolutely have to have credible policies that are based on facts and data.
And is part of the concern that, when combined, these policies seem like, if they all come around the same time, have a bit of a multiplying effect, and it's a large amount of change in a short amount of time for the industry. Is that a big part?
That's exactly right, Jamo. The agricultural minister actually only has control of a very small percentage of those policies. People think, that agriculture is the agriculture minister, the agriculture department. But in actual fact, if you look at things like transmission lines, for example, which are impacting so many people these days, that could arguably be said to generate from Chris Bowen's office or from Tanya Plibersek's office, for that matter. And in fact, all the ministers are engaged. When you talk about water, it's not, it's about the Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek. So, all of those ministers are concentrating, very strongly on their particular issues, but in actual fact, they can combine then to have an absolutely massive impact on an industry that involves all of them when you're looking after land management and you're looking after producing food and fibre.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the kind words too, Jamison.
Mike Foley from the SMH and The Age.
Hi, Fiona, and on behalf of all the journalists, I think thank you very much for your access and openness to speaking to the media with all the spicy issues over the years. We appreciate the headlines. But taking you back to the start of your advocacy that you mentioned, opposing BHP at Karuna on the Liverpool Plains, Shenhua as well. And for people that don't know, some of the most productive farmland in the world, let alone Australia. But just a bit of a big picture question, if I may, but that's, obviously you were talking about, I think you used the words of the stupidity of a non-renewable, one-off extractive round of industry. And now we've got a situation where NFF, looking for sustainability, is an advocate for climate action. Natural disasters, drought, floods will impact agricultural production, ability to feed the world, food prices and so on. But I think it's fair to say NFF is participating in some community campaigns that are pretty, they're causing a lot of roadblocks for transmission line rollouts. They're creating some headaches for renewables investors in wind and solar farms, I think is a reasonable position to describe it as. But some big picture question is, does the farm sector need to bend a little on this issue, given the dire need to reduce emissions for agriculture production? Or put it another way, just to finish off, why should other industry, like the BHPs of the world, invest heavily in that drought-reducing, lower emissions technology if the farm sector is going to hang out for a better deal on transmission lines?
I think that's a bit. That's a bit cut and dried, and that's not at all how it is, Mike. I actually think part of the problem here, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we're in favour of renewable energy. We're certainly in favour of the benefits that brings to our sector and the benefit that brings to our farms. But that doesn't mean that the rights of landholders should be trodden over by developers who have carte blanche to come and talk to farmers, or think that they have carte blanche to talk to farmers and walk all over their land. And what we've seen in recent times, particularly around transmission lines and the planning of those, is that farmers and landholders have been the last to know. And it's so similar to the experience that we had on the Liverpool Plains so many years ago, where developers used to leave a little note on the door of somebody's farm and say, we're just going to do some testing, let us, you can't stop us, let us, we'll talk to you at some point. I mean, it all comes down, from my perspective, whether you're talking about mining, whether you're talking about, there's so many different things now that use land use, that are competing for land use. But at the end of the day, we must have respect for landholders. We need to have respect for the people who manage those lands. And it comes back to a robust planning process that we don't have in Australia, whether we're talking about mining and agricultural land, whether we're talking about transmission lines and energy developments, or whatever it is. It's a developer-driven process. And I understand why that's the case. It's much easier for governments to let the developers, do what they do, spend their money where they do. But what it means is that sometimes we have really inappropriate developments in inappropriate places. And I reckon the community is asking for better. The community wants more. The community wants a say in it. And you can be in favour of renewable energy and insisting on a proper go for landholders at the same time. And that's really what we're doing.
So, sort of... Yeah. In terms of planning reform, no-go zones or development-approved areas, would that be helpful, like in coal mining?
It's involving communities at the very first stage. So instead of communities being told that a transmission line is coming through, instead of landholders being told that there's been a 100-metre easement driven up, it's about actually involving communities in the planning of these things. And where we do that, there are some great examples of wind farms, for example, that are community-owned, that have taken 8 to 10 years to build, but are hugely successful because of the engagement and involvement that every member of that community has had in planning their development. Now, if we continue to have developers coming through and treating landholders just like a bit of an obstacle, then we're going to continue to have the fights that we're currently having. And I think that's a shame. I think we should support best practice. It's been established in so many industries, yet we continue to ignore it and just let developers go on as they do. We need to reform that planning process. We need to make sure that facts can actually form some of that planning decision. Where is some of the productive agricultural land? What are the farmers doing? How can we involve farmers in that? Maybe it's not so many massive grids. Maybe it's more a diverse microgrid model, such as Helen Haynes's model that we've supported. Let's look at some of those things and let's solve this, because we do need renewable energy. We need it soon, and the ag sector needs it more than ever.
Gabby Chan is from The Guardian.
Hi Fiona, thanks very much for that speech and also for your access over the years. I want to take you to the EU deal and circle back on Kath's question, because I did see the statement from the NFF and the idea of a dud deal, but you didn't exactly spell out what the key issues were. So what are the red line issues for you that you would not support? And I'll take you to two of them that I suspect might be an issue. One of them is revolves around the law that the EU's put in about deforestation and commodities from areas that have been recently cleared. Why is that an issue? Do you want to clear more country? And also the other one is Indigenous prior and informed consent. The idea of giving a voice, dare I say it, to Indigenous people, because in your roadmap, your 2030 roadmap, you actually talk about coexistence agreements with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. It's probably dangerous if I start going into too many of the commodities in detail, because it's about tariffs and quotas and conditionality and all sorts of different things. I think I'll sum up. You asked me specifically about deforestation, and I think I could sum that one up by saying that in our agricultural sustainability framework, it brings together the metrics of all our different industries and is measured on 17 different criteria. And right now there are actually people from NFF and the Australian Farm Institute in Europe talking to the FAO and the UN about that globally leading framework that I spoke about in my speech. So the difficulty we have sometimes is that the EU want to apply things that are very relevant in their own countries, and we see this in terms of chemicals or what they call deforestation or whatever it is, that aren't as relevant here and to our land management practices. And so some of the so-called, I think the land clearing that the EU is referring to is Brazilian rainforests and things like that. Some of the routine woody weed management that we do in Australia sometimes gets captured in that as well. So we want to make sure that we can utilise and maximise our Australian sustainability frameworks and that they can stand up to the rigour of any of those things. It doesn't make sense that here in Australia we should have to actually put in place or obey laws that don't make sense to us, whether you're talking about the different chemicals that we use, the different land management practices that we have in a completely different environment. It's no less rigorous here, it's just different. And so we want to make sure that they recognise our sustainability standards just as much as we recognise theirs and their right to make those standards. So I guess that's one thing that does actually apply across the board to a number of commodities. You mentioned deforestation, but it's also a whole lot of other things in respect of those standards across the board and what we're calling conditionality. You also talked about an Indigenous voice, and NFF absolutely is pursuing that roadmap goal as well. And right now we have a policy and a reference group that is actually trying to pursue how we can actually maximise that and what is the best way forward when it comes to talking to Indigenous groups. And so in the light of the recent referendum, we'll regroup and have a look at how we do that. But certainly it is one of the goals in the roadmap that we're very, very serious about. In the Liverpool Plains, I think we've probably led the way in a number of agreements where we've worked with Indigenous people on a number of issues.
So just to clarify, you would rather no EU deal than some of those things included in the agreement?
So at the moment, with the current offers on the table, and of course our negotiators are in Brussels right now, so who knows whether that might change before Osaka next week. But at the moment, our industry has said that they would rather stay at the table, that they would rather Minister Farrell walk away from what's currently on the table, even given that it could take some time to get a new deal, rather than subject us to something that is going to last for probably a generation, 40 or 50 years, and will actually take some elements of our industry backwards in terms of the access that they currently have, in terms of the cost to the industry of implementing EU things like GIs, for example, the dairy industry. And so we understand that there's been a lot of work done. You know, the negotiators have been working really hard in this space, but at the moment it's really not a good deal. It's not a commercially viable deal for nearly any sector of our industry.
Thank you.
Jane Norman from the ABC.
Hi Fiona, thank you for your speech today. Hello. I had two questions, Solly, if that's okay. The first was when you mentioned the Liverpool Plains, the coal seam gas expansion many years ago. We're now seeing, as you mentioned, a huge expansion of renewables and of transmission lines. Do you see any parallels between the two, albeit with very different environmental impacts? And just on the EU trade deal, if Don Farrell manages to sign this, it would be his first free trade deal signed as Trade Minister. To what extent, well, I guess how concerned are you that kind of political win, in inverted commas, might be really weighing on him as he goes to Osaka this week?
Look, I think, I wonder whether he did sign off on the UK deal too.
I think it's signed off, but I guess it's the first. I think it was ratified.
Oh, okay, right, because it's a fabulous deal.
The one that cost you the ag visa?
Yes, well, no, that's a government decision. Keeping you in line. So Minister Farrell has to weigh a lot of things up. He certainly does. You know, he's got other sectors that may or may not be doing, you know, well under the EU trade deal. Australia, you know, it's a give and take thing, so he has to work out whether on the whole the benefits outweigh the risks and outweigh the damage. And at the moment, Australian agriculture is saying to him, right now, with the current offers on the table, it's just not good enough. It's taking industry, you know, many parts of industry backwards. We need to work harder. So it's not walk away and go away. It's walk away and stay at the table. You know, keep talking, make sure, and we're saying to Minister Farrell, you know, we are an incredibly important sector. You know, we think that we've got a lot to offer EU consumers, and likewise. Trade deals are win-wins. And yes, I'm sure he would like to ink this deal, but it's also, you know, timing in terms of the EU elections. It really suits the EU to be doing a deal right now before they actually change over EU commissioners. So I actually think, you know, we're saying to him, stay at the table, make sure if we don't get better offers than what's currently there, let's make sure that we can. Let's work harder, and yes, you'll probably still get the chance to ink the deal, but let's do it in a time and a place where it's right, and let's make sure that we actually can benefit as a sector rather than anything else. In terms of the Liverpool Plains and the mining and the trades, I think I see so many parallels, and it makes me sad because back in the day, you know, we wrote best practice practice policy guides to landholder access. We wrote best practice policy guides to how you look at agricultural land and weigh up the benefits of development on that land. New South Wales farmers wrote a best practice community wind farm guide. And as I've been, travelling around over the last 7 years, and particularly now with transmission lines, it seems that we always have to reinvent the wheel. It's like those guides were never actually ever written. It seems that we're starting over landholder access rights all over again, and that people are being approached and told that they have no rights because it's a state significant project or a national significant project. That's just not good enough. These days we should be able to learn from our mistakes. We should be able to learn and grow on the decisions and the policies that we have. And if we actually implemented those, it would save so much heartache in rural and regional communities and really make people feel that they were a part of this amazing new process as we move towards renewable energy. Thank you.
Can I just go back to the ag worker visa?
Are you going to correct me again?
I think I might need to correct myself. It was promised a couple of times by the Coalition, but most recently on the sidelines of the UK free trade agreement. But when Labor came to government, they said they didn't want to pursue a separate ag visa for farm workers.
That's right.
Was that one of your great disappointments during your advocacy?
Yeah, it was. And we certainly really spoke long and hard to the government about the ag visa. We designed it initially, and it took us a long time to convince the government to take it on. And by the time the opportunity came up as a result of the negotiations and I think internal negotiations really here, then we weren't actually able to get a single worker on the ground. So it was. We knew. We fought very hard for it during the election campaign. We tried very hard to get a commitment from the government, but we couldn't achieve that. And so once the government came in, then really we had to concentrate on what we could do in the space, which was to try and focus on new visas, to work with the unions in a tripartite process, and to really get the best outcomes that we possibly could.
Simon Gross is from Canberra IQ.
One of the most bizarre political plays this year has been Tanya's Basin Plan Reform Bill. She couldn't get Victoria in the tent, so she just went ahead without Victoria. And that's bizarre in itself, but the public and media response has been so bland. It's amazingly bizarre. Victoria is defined by the Murray. Do you understand, can you tell us anything that you understand the dynamics of that process and her decision? And if the bill passes in its current form, what do you foresee?
Look, I so hope the bill doesn't pass in its current form, and we're lobbying really hard, and we met just last week. We had a roundtable with Minister Plibersek and Minister Watt to talk further about our concerns.
So is she sensible?
Tanya's sensible, very sensible, the Minister's sensible, but it's, I think it's about how some of these bills come to fruition and how the decisions are then being made. I was around when the bill was first drawn up, when the guide to the plan was actually drawn up, and for those of you who were there, it was absolutely fraught. And the communities, I spent every week in Griffith for months doing roundholder, kitchen table meetings, talking to landholders, and it was a huge focus to try and get everyone to agree. And part of that agreement was understanding and agreeing that those rural and regional communities are really important, that socioeconomic outcomes have to be considered as part of the package alongside environmental packages. It's the same thing, isn't it? We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't just think about environment only, we have to think about the people as well. Environment's important, but so are the people. Environment's important, the water is important, but so are rural and regional communities. And so that's why some of those protections that are in the current plan are there. And we explained those to the ministers, particularly because they do remove, the current bill does remove the socioeconomic test, and it also opens up the field for many more buybacks, extensive buybacks. Which will harm rural and regional communities. We know that. Robbie Sefton's here today. Her report, looked at some of the impacts that those buybacks had on communities. So at the end of the day, as it goes to the Senate, it's going to a Senate committee, we will continue to put forward the facts and that data to the Senate. And I ask everybody, I implore everybody to do the same, to make sure you engage in the process, because that's only the only way that we can make bad policy become good policy.
That's one sensible minister. Any non-sensible ministers?
Of course, all the ministers are very, very sensible.
Nick Stewart is from Ability News.
Thank you very much for your speech, although I do wish you hadn't let out the secret that behind every balding, middle-aged, white Anglo male, there is a very smart, dynamic woman. We could have kept that quiet. I was particularly wondering about, as you know, the NDIS review is just about to come out. Farmers in particular have a greater proportion of disability, work-caused disability than other sectors of the economy. Are there any particular concerns that you have about what this is going to mean for particularly people in the country who are disabled?
Yeah, look, thanks, Nick. And I have to say up front, I'm not across the data on this, and I'm not across the detail on it. But I would certainly say from the disabled farmers that I know, and there are a number of them, they do depend on the NDIS for some, I guess, varied support that may not spring to mind when you normally think of disabled people and what they might need to do their jobs on farm. And, you know, the implements that they need, the machinery that they need, the helpers that they need, they're all quite different to somebody who may have an office job in the city. So I think we need to retain the flexibility. We need to understand that people who live in rural and regional areas and people who live on farms may have different needs to those who live elsewhere. And it's important that in any new scheme that we bring forward, that it actually still can cater for some of that flexibility that we need. Thank you.
Tim Lester from the Australian Council for Agricultural Journalists and also a committee member here at the National Rural Press Club.
Thanks, Kath. Thank you, Fiona, very much for your speech. There's a bit of a dance that goes on between the media and advocacy bodies, as we know. My initial question here is, what's your advice on both sides of that to maximise the relationship? What do the media need to know and what do the advocates need to know? And while you think about that, then my second question is, what's the greatest story we haven't told?
I needed a heads up about that one. Look, I think during my time, I have very much concentrated, and the NFF has concentrated on building relationships and relationships with journos. And I think by being able to have those relationships, to be able to make sure that we can background and brief journalists on stories that are happening, that we can make sure that we can put our perspective forward, that we remain open to journalists. Mike thanked me earlier for my engagement with journalists, and while I've got a little bit lazy in recent weeks, not taken those calls at all hours of the day and night, I think all our team at NFF does actually have that availability. We can talk to journalists, and we will talk to journalists if they're doing a story that has interest in our sector. And we have to keep doing that. So I think on both sides, we need, first of all, the journalists' willingness to perhaps hear a story and to open their mind to a different opinion and view than they might have read on social media or heard about from their other sources. We need a genuine willingness from them to explore the story accurately and fairly. And then we also need farmers to be open to that. So not just advocacy bodies like us, but farmers themselves. And, you know, I know we often get asked to put farmers forward for stories, and it's incredibly hard. Farmers get nervous about it. Farmers think they're going to say the wrong thing. Farmers think they're going to show something that's wrong. We spend a lot of time, training farmers and helping farmers to tell their story and to video their story and to say it like it is without too many frills and different things. And I think we need as farmers, everybody needs to think it's not just the NFF's responsibility. It's not just our advocacy body's responsibility. It's my responsibility. It's my responsibility as a farmer to tell my story. It's my responsibility as a farmer to work out the best way to say it, to understand that there's some things that I shouldn't probably say and would not go down well, and other things that I can absolutely put out there. So I'd say everybody needs to take responsibility. Both sides need to, and we need to keep building those relationships. The best story that hasn't been told. I don't know, I think we need more of the same. I think it's the farmers' stories on land. Like every time I meet farmers, the further outback I go, the better they get, of farmers who absolutely love what they do. And I don't think that always comes through. So often we are on the complaining end of policy. I mean, one of the reasons we did the 2030 roadmap was that so we could get a proactive approach to our policy settings, proactive with government, where we could really put out where we wanted to be and can take control of our own destiny. But the love story that farmers have with their land is something that is really very hard to convey. but it's something that, it's going to make me teary, it's something that I see every day. On my own farm, when you look down at the soil and people look for roots in the weeds. Sorry, they don't look for weeds. They look for roots in their crops, and they can name the insects and the birds and the spiders, and they're totally involved with their environment. It's that story that I think we fight very, very hard to tell. And it's that story that we need to keep telling if we're going to keep connecting with those urban consumers and the people who are making the decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike Foley has another question.
Oh, he would,
to
wouldn't he?
knock the emotion.
I thought it would be remiss. He just mentioned things that you probably shouldn't say, so let's talk about that.
Oh, have I said any?
Just if you could, you're not in the role anymore as of now, according to
Tomorrow.
me. We've had, just to reflect on political representation, if you could, I think it's fair enough to say that farmers overwhelmingly vote for the National Party across the country on average. We've had the last term of government, the much vaunted Inland Rail blew out to $30 billion and fizzled out without a completion. $7 billion dam fund that went unspent, to name a few. So, is rural Australia, particularly the farm sector, better represented by independents now or the Nationals?
You have to ask me tomorrow, Mike.
Jump forward in time for us.
Look, I think as I said, the face of farming is changing. People are asking and wanting different things from their representatives. People's attitudes and views are changing. I quoted some figures to you about the young farmers now that are coming on to and taking over our farms, taking control of our farms. On our own farm, we're doing that. And our son has married a wonderful person who has so many different skills that she's bringing onto the farm as well now. And that's happening right across rural and regional Australia. And I don't think you can make assumptions about that anymore. I think, really, farmers are wanting people who represent their interests. Farmers are wanting people who care deeply about their communities. Farmers want people who can actually get outcomes and achieve outcomes for their communities. And that's why, Gabby's written a book about it. Yeah, plug for it, Rusted Off. So that's why I think, we can't take anything for granted. Nobody can take anything for granted. At the end of the day, the face of farming is changing, and I think some of those things will change along with it.
If he gets one, I get one. Future Drought Fund. Heading into roaring drought in parts of Australia, particularly northern at the moment, which I don't need to tell you about. Farmers are talking to us every day about they can't get slots at abattoirs. They've got massive feed bills. There's been about, I think last time I counted, about 250 million rolled out from the Future Drought Fund just in 3 years, 100 million supposedly for the next annually. What is the measure of success for that? Because a lot of farmers I talk to on the ground haven't had interaction with those drought hubs. And does it mean that the next time we're in a drought and people start putting on akubras and going out to rural Australia, that you will not be asking for any other support? Because that was the idea of it, to get out ahead and prepare.
Yeah, and I acknowledge Brent Finlay, who is the chair of the Future Drought Fund over there on table 8, who of course could answer this question much better than me. But what I will say is that we've spent a heap of time, Gabby, like really a long time, in the last drought and the very short period of time that we had before seasons have gone bad again, seemingly, across so much of Australia. And look, I really want to acknowledge all the farmers out there now too who are having a really tough time of it. It seems cruel that after only 2 good seasons, the rain's turned off in so many parts of Australia, and it's incredibly stressful for those people, and it's incredibly stressful to think about what comes next. So I just really want to acknowledge all of them as well. But I think, the Future Drought Fund took a little while to kick off. It's been in operation for a few years, but the drought hubs certainly have taken a while to kick off. So I think some of the work that they're doing is not going to be seen in a year or 2. It's going to be seen over a long period of time as people change the practices on farm, as they look at different ways of doing things to try and become more resilient in a farm sense and a business sense. So, I'm not going to stick up for it. I don't know enough about it, but I think we do need to keep working on that to make sure that the projects are relevant, to make sure that people are actually engaged in those drought hubs, because unless they can, have the extension, unless they can have the connection to the farmers on the ground, then they will fail. So that's the first thing. And I think, Brandy's very aware of that. He's very aware of the need to keep building that work and to keep spending that money on things that are actually going to help farmers on the ground. So that's important. Secondly, I think it's really interesting, and I know leaders are actually questioning themselves a little bit at the moment, because with this dry spell that we're seeing right now, which has been determined a drought in a number of areas, people are selling off their stock in record numbers. And so in a way, I look at myself and think, wow, have I really done my job too well? Because we've said to people, be prepared, make sure that you make these decisions ahead of time. Make sure you don't get stuck thinking that it will rain next time if it's not going to rain. And so what we've seen now is, of course, a massive tanking of prices in cattle particularly, but also sheep across the board, because of the livestock, the sheer numbers of livestock that are being turned off. So, farmers, I think, are much, much better at thinking about this now, but we've still got a long way to go. We need research. We need to make sure that we can keep improving what we do on farm. We need to make sure that education, that information is flowing through to every farmer, and we need to make that available, and we need to do it better. We always need to do it better.
Always more work to be done. Would you please join me in thanking Fiona Simson for her address today?
Thank you very much.